So our first participant for the panel is MS Chaitra sir. May I request Professor Chaitra sir to please come onto the stage and join the panel. So, Chaitra sir is an ecologist currently working at Fellow at Development Foundation, Bangalore. His research currently involves understanding the crisis of biodiversity and its impact on human society in human-degraded semi-arid tropics. He has worked in University of Mysore, Utkal University, Tumkur University, Wildlife Institute of India, CCMB Hyderabad, and Center for Ecological Sciences at IAC. Thank you, sir. Our next participant for the panel discussion is Mr. James Kennedy. May I request Mr. James Kennedy to please come to our stage and join the panel. Mr. Kennedy has an MBA from London Business School, and he is an entrepreneur and early stage investor who founded and now runs one of the largest granite mining and rock crushing companies in Kerala. He is the founder and chairman of Smart Sparks, an angel network with more than 25 young and successful investors based in the Malabar region. He is also the chapter champion of EO Enterprises organization in Kerala, who has done business in more than a dozen countries and has co-founded, invested in over 15 ventures across diverse sectors, including agribusiness, manufacturing, mining, food processing, healthcare, online marketing, contract farming, real estate, e-commerce, data analytics, consulting, and hyperlocal logistics. Thank you, sir, for being in the panel. Our next participant comprises of Professor Siddharth Mohapatra from IIM Kozhikode. May I request Professor Mohapatra to please come onto the stage and join the panel. Professor Mohapatra is a faculty at the Indian Institute of Management, Kozhikode. He is PhD in Business and Management from Ca' Foscari University, Venice, Italy. Currently, he teaches business ethics, sustainability, and strategic CSR and philosophy of research at the Indian Institute of Management, Kozhikode. Some of the notable for-profit organizations that he was employed in the past are the Indian subsidiaries of Aluminium Canada at Montreal and ZSK Stick Maschinen at Germany. The non-profit companies which he is associated with are the Autism Society Alberta at Canada and Björn Schulz Stiftung at Germany. Thank you, sir, for being in the panel, sir. Our next participant for the panel is Professor Jacob D. Ruver. May I request Professor Ruver to come to the stage and join the panel, sir. Professor Ruver is the assistant professor at Ghent University, Belgium. He is a prominent researcher at the Comparative Sciences of Culture. He has many well-acclaimed publications in prominent journals. His latest book in Europe, India, and the Limits of Secularism by Oxford University Press has been published in 2015. Thank you, sir, for being in the panels. Our next participant for the panel is Dr. S. Subramaniam from IIM Kozhikode. May I request Professor Subramaniam to please come onto the stage and join the panel. Dr. Subramaniam is an associate professor in the area of strategic management at IIM Kozhikode. He has more than 18 years of experience in the field of management in academics and industry put together. He has published more than 25 articles, case studies, and research papers in the strategic management area, particularly corporate governance and international business, in reputed journals and even in business magazines such as Forbes India, Economic Times, Business Standard, Business World, Business Today, and the New Indian Express. Thank you, sir, for your participation, sir. Now request Dr. Vishwanath to carry forward the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for being here. I come from the city of Bangalore, and in Bangalore, many of the carpenters are from the state of Uttar Pradesh, and most of the UP carpenters come from one city called Gorakhpur. Many of the plumbers in Bangalore and Delhi are from Odisha. The entire Surat diamond industry and power loom industry is run by migrant workers from Odisha, many of them concentrated in 2 districts of Odisha. And the point I'm trying to make when I say this is that you've got a cultural kaleidoscope here. What happens in Odisha, what happens with migrants from UP is that they come in groups. They don't come in as individuals. There is a cultural connect here, which which helps them when they move. And how does it help them? It helps them because they are unable, the state is unable to provide them with the legal means, despite laws, to actually survive in the way and dignified labor is supposed to survive. I have myself been inside the power looms of Surat. Almost had my eardrums burst when I was standing with those workers there. They live together, they eat together, and there are 3 lakhs of Odisha migrants in that nobody cares about. They don't care about. The Odisha government doesn't care about it, and the Gujarat government, which is supposed to have the biggest occupational health and safety institution in Gandhinagar, doesn't care about it. I myself, as an organizational head, had 4 tribal laborers from Jharkhand go to a company in Chennai, hired for their skills after we did a bit of skill development, supposed to be employable. They lasted 2 months and they came back. You know why they came back? It had nothing to do with their wages. It had nothing to do with an employer-employee relationship. They just couldn't handle the food. So when we talk culture and management, we forget that we have to factor in these things when we talk about employability, when we talk about hiring, when we talk about wanting to actually be inclusive. So I have made my sort of opening statement in this fashion because I think management, if we have to go ahead in the future, if we talk about inclusion, it has to include culture. Because we tend not to see that. We see them as individuals who will connect to their companies, who will connect to their environment in ways that the company thinks it will happen. Because that's been mandated by the company. But the reason India survives and the reason India is reasonably conflict-ridden, is conflict-free, I should say, is because groups of people come together for their own survival. And it's the cultural connect that makes it happen. So when we talk about culture and management, what are the interests and incentives that we can build in to management going forward? And what is the meeting point of culture, of the way we do things, of things important to us, and a system of a worldview that is globalized, that we have, that we are inheriting, and continue to be frameworked by, if you like. So that is broadly the area that I feel we needed to discuss, because that's rarely discussed as to what this meeting point is. And I'll turn to Chaitra with his conservation background. Can you sort of articulate a bit from the conservation point of view what these interests, incentives, or meeting points of culture and management could be?
Thank you. Thank you, Vanitha ma'am. Before getting into this question, the part that I will not say now, but Jacob will come back to that point, is to reflect about the very question, what is this Indian way of management? Is there such a thing? I mean, how do we really conceptualize? How do we understand the question? I will leave that part to Jacob, and then I will get back to the conservation part. And she has been asking me this question much outside this also. We have been talking about it for actually quite a time, for a couple of years now. Now, one of the simple way that I want to formulate it like this. One way to understand, if you think that there is something meaningful to talk about Indian way of managing thing, is one way is to look at how did Indians have preserved these ways of managing in this world over a period of time, consistently. And if you try focusing on how, is there a set of organization where they have reflected and conserved these ways of running the organization over a long periods in time. And then we can raise this question, how did Indians conceptualize such a thing? And I wanted to take this discussion with what yesterday evening Professor Balu was saying, that one of the ways that Indians looked at the management, they thought about management in this way. That they thought that management is all about facilitating and nurturing certain patterns of interactions and cooperations among the stakeholders. Not really among the shareholders, but really among the stakeholders. Then the stakeholder is a much bigger category than the shareholder category. And if you want to really run the organization, it's very important that there is a particular nature of interaction and cooperation must exist between various stakeholders. And one of the ways to talk about that interaction is to go and look at the way that Indians have managed temples for thousands of years now. So we have, for example, to give you an example, in literature you find for about 1300 years there are temples which have been consistently managed in exactly same way. You can go to Kolar, you have epigraphs which gives you evidences. So one of the things that if you look at temple management outside the government, outside the state control, you would realize that a range of activities have been assigned to a range of stakeholders and they have mechanisms of communicating with each other. Who will bring the betel nut? Who will bring what kind of patra? What kind of pushpa? On which day? Which season? Who had to bring what? I mean, this requires an enormous, complicated ways of negotiation, interacting with each other, cooperating with each other. And it has to be done in such a way that nobody in the temple controls the power. So if one or two people actually gets hold of the power, then the whole activity can go haywire and it might lead to the damage of the temple. So you can give some of the studies which shows that, for example, Kolarama temple, if you go to look at the inscription of the 8th century in the Kolarama temple and the practices that exist even today in Kolar city, in the Kolarama temple, you can see an absolute conservation of these interactions and cooperation, and they have been nurtured. So therefore, if you want to do an investment, how do you make investment? And the epigraphs will tell you, from betel nut to liquor to cleaning the floor, everybody gets some kind of an endowment allocation. There is a resource management that is being done. The next part I wanted to bring it to your attention here is as simple as this, that not only that Indians have thought about this way of reflecting on the cooperation and the interactions that had to happen, but they also made sure that there is no collusion of different ruling classes, so that power does not get accumulated disproportionately in different sectors, so that stakeholders will run into problem in facilitating this interaction. I think there is a phenomenally complex way of looking at how an organization should be run. It's unfortunate that when we talk about Indian way of management, these organizations does not come to our mind at all. And not that we have adequate theoretical understanding today, but I think if we put the question in this way of how do Indians really manage this? How did they really think about it? The 2 points, 2 dimensions of one is about the interactions and cooperation, another one is about stopping this collusion of classes that I drew from what Balu had proposed yesterday, would be a good beginning point to really figure out how did Indian really thought about the management. Therefore, it makes some interesting sense to take this question, is there an Indian way of management? So there exists an Indian way of management in the sense that Indians have thought about how to manage complex organizations. I mean, does that mean that there is something which is peculiarly unique to Indians? I'm not very sure about it. But this way of framing the question becomes extremely productive and helpful in thinking about how do we think of organizations even today. Business corporations, how do we think about it? What do we learn? How do we handle the fight for this power inside the organizations? How do we handle, how do we ensure that there is a smooth cooperation among different sections within the corporation, because there are communication breakdown, decision making, delays. They need to be thought of in an extremely critical manner. So with this, I would stop my opening remark.
Thank you, Chaitra. Jacob, would you like to pick up on the thought of, as a European, how do you view the cultural basis of management?
Yes, I would like to do that. Thank you, Madam Moderator. Now, if we take this question, is there an Indian way of management? And let's start with me as a European, trying to make sense of this question. It's actually a badly formulated question. We first need to make sense of the question itself, because you don't know which facts are relevant to answer the question. Say I come to India. I try to answer this question. What should I look at? Is there an Indian way of management? Should I look at, say, highly successful organizations, perhaps the temples, which are very intriguing, the Dabbawalas of Mumbai, incredible organization, highly precise, highly successful, very efficient. But then there's, say, solid waste management in India, which is an absolute disaster, one of the worst failures in the world. Is that the Indian way of management? Or is the first the Indian way of management? Do you have to look at the average IAS officer? Does the Indian way of management involve business-to-business corruption, bribing, or is that alien to the Indian way of management? So as a first step, the question itself needs to be made sense of. Because then you can take a second step and say, actually these failures have to do with the fact that Indians have not picked up the scientific way of management that has been developed in the US, at the business schools, Wharton, Harvard, etc. They don't have the proper sense of order, which is an explanation that Jayant Sinha, who later became Minister of State for Finance, actually gave at some point. He said, see, the problem of India is the way we don't know how to queue when we enter an elevator. Everyone tries to get in at the same time. So we don't have a sense of order. Therefore, that first has to change. Now you might say, well, actually Indians have picked up these management models and been very successful at them. You can also say that because many of the most successful CEOs in the US today are Indians. You might point to these people, Sundar Pichai, Satya Nadella, these kinds of people, and say, this is the Indian way of management. Now, again, is that how we can make sense of the question, or isn't it? Now, the third way is, say, we look into Indian culture. How do we do so? We turn to ancient texts. We turn to the Gita, to the Vedas, and say, we'll draw management lessons from those texts. Now, I've read some of this literature. It's highly disappointing, because what it does, without being aware of this, it picks up a Western story, the story that Western culture has told about India, modifies it slightly to make it sound positive, reads the texts in that way, accepts translations of the texts, and then claims this is Indian way of management. I tortured myself reading Devdutt Patnaik's Business Sutra. I mean, this is incredible. The man says, look, the problem is we have looked at management against the background of a Western belief system. And management is all about beliefs, because practices express beliefs. Now, this first assumption of Western study of cultures is that you should look at the beliefs of people. What does he do? Turns towards the myths. Now, that notion itself is highly problematic. What does he say there? Well, says things like, because Indians believe in reincarnation, again, story that comes from how Christians, Western Christians understood Indian traditions, because they believe in incarnation, they have place for all kinds of people and also for the irrational and the subjective. So they highlight the subjective, therefore they have a management that does not revolve around goals, but around people. Story like this. Now, first of all, as I said, that's Western story. about India, largely a colonial story which has just been given a twist. Secondly, it's a cliche from today's HR management. Management should not be about benchmarks and goals, but about the welfare of the people. They say that in my university today. And it's going awry. I mean, it doesn't work because it's just a cliche. Now, what Chaitra just talked about, I think, is a fourth way which does allow us to make sense of the question and which makes it interesting to people no matter where you're from or which culture you're from. The first three depend on whether you're sympathetic or unsympathetic to Indian culture. If you're sympathetic, you'll say, look at all the beautiful things and say, this is Indian way of management. If you're not, you'll look at all the bad things and say, this is Indian way of management. But when you turn to the question, how have Indian intellectuals thought about organizations, about managing organizations over the past centuries and millennia, and you begin to show that they offer an alternative to the absolutely disastrous situation that we're in today. And what Professor Balu talked about yesterday, stories about business management, and today there's a good term for those stories. I mean, there's a book by that title, Business Bullshit, it's called. They move into society, institutions like the university, and they start creating problems, creating conflicts, creating disruptions instead of solving them. If you can show there's an alternative way of thinking about management, which developed in India, in Indian culture, which is also linked to the culture that India is, but which offers an alternative to all the stories that have come from the West, which is superior to those stories, then this becomes a highly fascinating question.
Okay, thank you. Vinay, you're an entrepreneur, and you're in a variety of different businesses that you've set up or involved in. You are in industries like mining and so on, highly controversial in current situation, and most of these businesses are located in areas of biodiversity, high levels of biodiversity which have to be conserved. They also are located in areas where there are a large number of populations who have their own cultures, and for whom this is considered almost an assault on their culture. What would be the meeting point, given where we are today for business and management?
Hello. Yeah. So I had a few things to say about Indian way of management. I'll come to that. I'll answer the first question. So with regard to mining, I believe that there needs to be clarity in terms of the laws. I was never into mining. I was out of the country for about, I was in London in the US for quite a while. I was in technology and quite a few other businesses, and came back to India. And then when I got into mining, I decided that I had actually confirmed that there is a way to do it responsibly and fully legitimately. And that is how I got started. So one of the ways in which we are different is our scale is substantially larger, and we adhere to all regulatory norms. The biggest problem is exactly what you said. About 80% of the mining that happens is right now technically illegal. And few occasions like the floods, and there are times of the year when the government actually comes down on such mines and stops them. And those are the best days of the year for us. So which is one of the reasons why I believe it is good to have clarity and good to have a government that actually implements those laws. In fact, I might be the only miner in Kerala who talks about being carbon negative and all that. We work on a lot on the environment. We make sure we adhere to all laws. Our margins are substantially lower than any other mine. That's solely because of this. So I'm all for bringing in regulation a lot more strongly, and there being clarity in regulation, because a lot of the illegal mines actually do not very blatantly violate laws. They exploit loopholes in the lack of clarity and the vagueness in the laws. So I'm all for it. Now, coming to the Indian way of management, about 10 years back, I'd already been an entrepreneur for quite a few years. I had done business in about 14 countries. I had an office in the US, a business that I had just exited out of. My entire marketing team was American in my Southern California office. And I just started helping American SMEs to enter the Indian market. So I used to talk a lot about idiosyncrasies in management in India, because that's one of my trump cards, something that I could talk about to make sure these SMEs come to me to enter the Indian market. So those days I actually believed that there was an idiosyncratic Indian way of management. Fast forward 3 years, I'd finished my second MBA at London Business School then, and then I spent about 6 months in Buenos Aires. So that is when I realized that a lot of the things that I thought were specific to India is actually not all that specific to India. Then I started looking more into what the different characteristics that manifested as the style of management were. And then I realized a lot of it was because of the general demography. A lot of it was because of the fact that it was a populist democracy. In fact, even that had a huge impact. And some of it was because of a general cultural, in fact, about 6 of the 10 points I defined then were because of a general belief, social conditioning that let people believe that commitments are flexible, can be flexible. A lot of aspects. In fact, I used to talk about market dynamism. Now, market being dynamic and situations being dynamic, teams needing to be dynamic, it's all because you have 1 billion people who believe that their deadlines, their timelines, their cost projections, they're all flexible. So imagine working in an environment like that. So I have a feeling that has a major impact on our style of management. But if we are to get to defining an Indian style of management or even an emerging market style of management, then we can't stop there. We need to go further. In the 5 hours north of Calicut, we have Calicut here. 2.5 hours, south of Calicut. For 2.5 hours south, we have Thrissur. And another 2.5 or 2 hours south, we have Kochi. There is a huge difference because I'm from the entrepreneurial community in Calicut, and about 75% of my family is based out of Cochin. So I see a huge difference in the Calicut way of management and in the Kochi way of management. And in between, we have a Thrissur way of management, which is also very different. So I don't think we can actually define an Indian way of management. And which is where I feel the relevance of management as both a science and an art comes into play. The science part of a management is what we can probably define. That can be objective. We can probably make a law and say it applies across the globe. But the art part of management is probably defined so because it leaves us the cushion to play around based on the context.
Back to you on what is the science part of management. Professor Subramaniam, just before I come to you, I have this is related to the Calicut part of management and Calicut style. There are some realities, ground realities in India that actually has to take become part of the framework of Indian management, if you like Indian management. And these are some very simple, to the West, this might be constraints. I'll give you an example. A few CEOs of a company foreign CEOs were interviewed, which I read, which basically talked about these flexible timelines for Indian employees that they can't handle this, that, and the other, and so on. You know, in the city of Delhi, in the morning, the city's buses are used for schools. You cannot get to your office before 10 o'clock in the morning. because you don't have transportation. And most workers, even managers, just have no way of getting to work. All right? Now, you could argue that India has to provide it. All right? We need the infrastructure, like all companies complain that, government is not doing this, government is not doing that. We don't have this. So, all right. But we do have constraints, we know it, it's resource constraints, it's a whole range of constraints, if you want to call it a constraint. Instead of that, in your strategic management thinking, can we build in something like this, the things that have been said here so far, so that it doesn't seem like a constraint, but it is the way we do things? And what is wrong with that?
Okay. Before I get into the, trying to answer this, I'll just talk about, I'm taking a reverse of the path that he has taken. I'll first talk about what I think as Indian way of management, and then I'll come back to that, seamlessly linking that. See, what I see is that every region, every society has its own way of management, which is closely linked to the religion. The US way and the US and British way of management, which is linked to the Protestant Christianity, and European way, which is linked to the Catholic and Arabian way, and Indian way linked to the Hinduist and Chinese way, or Far Eastern way, which is linked to the Buddhism. And but I could see that they are converging, and because the management practices have been developed at a period where we didn't have the kind of globalization that we have now. They are converging. They are taking the best practices from everywhere, trying to incorporate it. Initially, they are trying to accommodate the cultural dimensions. But over a period of time, I see that they converging. Coming back to the question, the constraint, I could see that the constraints themselves are seen as opportunities by Indian people and the Indian entrepreneurs and the managers, and they make business out of it. And he was talking about the lack of rule following behavior in India. True, that is there, but that I see as a reflection, as ma'am was suggesting, lack of resources, and limited resources are available. You need to grab them, and that reflects in the behavior. But as the country economically grows, the availability of resources would go up, and then the rule-based behavior would automatically chip in. I could see that happening in the city of Mumbai. There is much more order in the people's behavior in Mumbai, because there are enough opportunities for everybody. So as resources grow, as economic opportunities are available, people would automatically start following. So that's not an Indian behavior. I won't accept that. And I could see the other way around. The lack of resources, Indians are taking that as an opportunity. They are willing to see an opportunity in it, and develop business out of it. So that in a way actually helps in our own way of management. And also another important thing is that even though it might change in the future, as I already mentioned, Indians, the way business is at the end of the day for wealth. But what is wealth? How do we define wealth? That is in a way unique in India. Of course, it's unique in every region. Wealth, business is for creating wealth, but what is wealth? In the Western side, I see that they look in more individualistic and short-term oriented money making, whereas in India, the wealth is much more than that. It's not just about money. It's also about having respect, respecting the elders, so all these things get mixed in the management as well. I could put a lot of small examples. The famous example that I could quote to highlight the importance of elders and the respect for them in management, just as a single example, is that when, there is a problem between Ambani brothers, who belong to the largest private business group in India, Reliance Industries. They fought famously in 2005, and the structure of Ambani, the elder Ambani, Mukesh Ambani, was the chairman of the group, and the younger Ambani was fighting him. And if you look into the ownership structure of Reliance Industries at that point in time, it is designed in such a way that whoever is the chairman of Reliance Industries, has complete control over the company, and it cannot be legally challenged. So Ambani, the younger Ambani, Anil Ambani, knew that he cannot legally challenge his elder brother to get his share in the business. And he adopted many tricks. One of the tricks he adopted is to go to their mother. And, famously he said, "Mere paas maa hai." And their mother, Kokilaben Ambani, talked to Mukesh Ambani. Of course, that may not be the only reason. And Mukesh Ambani agreed to carve out half of the business to his younger brother. Mukesh Ambani need not have listened to their mother, because legally, if you look into the ownership structure of Reliance Industries at that point in time, it's almost impossible to question the hold of the chairman of the company in the ownership of the company, right? So he could have choose to fight a lengthy court battle with his brother, and finally, he might end up getting the entire control of the group. But he chose not to do that, and he gave almost half of his empire to his brother. So, this, I don't think we would see in Western context, right? Legally, you are in an untenable, very strong position. Still, you listen to your mother, and your mother doesn't have any stake in the company, or 0.13% stake in the company. So that gets into the values and cultures gets into the way of management, and that's a unique way. But I could see that changing in the younger generation, right? The younger generation, who are getting into the business, they in a way more towards, they mix the Western values, and they carve their own way of management, which is different from the traditional Indian way. I don't know whether it's going to last or not, but I could see that there would be a convergence. There would be a convergence because the Chinese are also adopting Western way, the Westerners are adopting Chinese way, the Japanese way, and Indians are also adopting Chinese way. So what I see is that there would be a convergence, even though right now we have an unique Indian way of doing things. Yeah.
Oh, I have it. Thanks. How much time do we have? How much more time? 20 minutes. Okay, all right. Professor Mahapatra, I noticed from the profile given that you have worked on human rights. And one of these questions I have for you, or if you can sort of articulate the connection you're making between management and human rights. And the reason I asked that question is, as we've all talked, and as is pretty obvious in India, the diversity and sub-identities and interests are huge. So it's a little difficult to say human rights as an overarching category. And to that extent, you've got Dalits saying Dalit rights. If the things go against Brahmins, very soon there'll be a Brahmin rights. So I'm wondering how, with this diverse kind of understanding, for one thing, is there an Indian way? And if you're using terms like human rights, how do you manage it in a country like India? And in relation to your management teaching.
I'll take us to 2006 when I was doing my master's in philanthropy and social entrepreneurship. One of my professors was Professor Burlingame from University of Indiana University, Indianapolis. So he had asked a question in the class which was having nationals from around 15 countries, that Amartya Sen and his capability approach. And the discussion went on for 15 minutes because there the master's program is not like here we have a textbook and things like that. They give us articles of their choice, and you can also bring your articles to the classroom, and there will be a discussion rather than lecturing per se. Then after 15 minutes, I just raised a question which made the classmates to erupt in laughter, that I asked, which Amartya Sen? And there were classmates from Brazil. Mariana asked me, don't you know who is Amartya Sen? I told Mariana, I don't know. I asked, who Amartya Sen? I asked, which Amartya Sen? So then there was some confusion and commotion in the classroom. And then I told the Amartya Sen was born in the East or groomed by the West. So when you are asking about human rights, I have not been taught in any other way apart from the Western way of human rights, and that too, that has been developed by John Stuart Mill, who is of course the founder of rights-based ethics. But I'll just take you to a little bit further by asking, I mean, if you are seeing human rights as a part of management, I mean, that's what the question was. Then I would like to start with the term management is not the way we Indians follow management as, because the term management has come from the Latin word manus. It means hand. Hand is a part of the person, not the heart of the person. And when the person is embedded in the East, I mean, a person, the Indian manager is embedded in the East, let's say through the meme, the behavioral traits which has come to him. One of those behavioral traits that I see in many parts of the world where Indians have made name and fame, including Indra Nooyi and Sundar Pichai and Satya Nadella and things like that, they have followed a concept called Vasudhaivam Kutumbakam in one way or another, maybe in a marginal way or a magnanimous way. To take the example of Indra Nooyi, she regularly contacts with the parents of her reportees, direct reportees. It's a way of seeing that my family, my professional family also goes to my juniors' families. So it's a part, I mean, we all are in one way groomed by the West, I mean, the people who are in the universities, most of us. But we have these memes which have come from, I think, from Vasudhaivam Kutumbakam kind of a thing. So when you are talking about human rights, well, I may do human rights in one way, but I may think human right in another way. I may, in my thinking process, I may take a broader picture of human, but in my doing, I am so, I will use the word handicap, that I will just see the Western side because that's what I know how to manage. I do not know there is a big, I mean, it's like an iceberg. I'm managing just a part of the human rights, and a lot is there which maybe due to lack of time, resources, both cognitive as well as physical, I am not doing justice to where I am standing as a manager.
I think what we'll do is we'll have some closing comments from everybody on the panel before we throw it open for questions. Is that okay? Yeah? So let's have it in about a minute each. You want to start?
See, one of the very interesting thing that appeared, which Jacob marked, how do you look at this question? So you might have this idea that there is this Indian way of management, but what it is, how do you recognize it and how do you deal with it? If you go a little technical detail, I mean, you saw in our panel, there is some kind of a, though there is this intuitive understanding of there is an Indian way of doing it, but what it is unclear for us for a variety of reasons. I mean, I will not get into the reasons why it is unclear. So one of the way which, I mean, I started thinking about is that if you are interested in, instead of finding out what is this, instead of getting into definitions, etc., we will simply ask what is those set of organizations that even today exists, about which how did they really think about? For thousands of years, how did they manage such an organization? And what could be an impediment to manage such an organization? Because if there is an organization which is run for 1,000 years or so, and then they would have also thought what could come and destroy it, and they would have thought some mechanisms to deal with it. If you look from that point of view, I think there is a new possibility of reflecting on this question in a much more serious fashion. I think that is where is my closing remark.
So, my closing comment would be that, there is an Indian way of management. So as a Chinese way of, or Far Eastern way of management, Western way of management, or Arabic way of management. But in the globalized world, unique or a single way of management with minor differences here and there would emerge, because the interaction between various ways of management is very high nowadays, and the best ideas, best practices would be picked up from each of these regions, and that will lead to more or less uniform way of management in the future. That may not be Western way, that may not be an Indian way, but a global way of management.
I would like to come back to the question about art of management and its relation to science of management. Because if you look at science as just systematic thinking, which generates knowledge, what is science of management today is just a way of, well, not even reflecting about, but it just tells us about how Americans have seen the world and have talked about the norms of their own society, or what they claim to be the norms. But it's very clear that this science of management has not fed the art of management, has not allowed for systematic thinking about the art of management that has improved the art of management, which is to be expected, because if anything, American society is a pathological society. It's falling apart, has the largest number of serial killers, of random shootings, incredible number of problems. So if you're going to take their way of systematic reflection about how you should manage organizations, it's to be expected that it'll go wrong. Now, a science of management, the way Professor Balu yesterday and Chaitra today talked about it, it's very clear that thinking, systematic thinking there, fed into the art of managing organizations, improved it in such a way that the organizations became more and more successful, were able to coordinate the patterns of interaction among all the stakeholders. So there, I think the relationship between science and art can be incredibly helpful. And actually the answer to, is there an Indian way of management, there becomes yes, and it'll help us develop a science of management that will keep improving the art of management instead of destroying it more and more.
Hi. I wasn't mostly talking about the merit of a particular science of management. I was more referring to the nature of the philosophy of management. So the reason I would call one part of it as science is because there is defined. If you look at any school of thought, there could be one part of it which would be more or less universal, like he was mentioning. And what could be universal, it could be the parts of operations management, because management is a lot more than just culture and all that. Like a lot of operations management, the way you look at numbers, a lot of finance, I would say there is a lot of system to it. Now, if you get into things like valuation and all that, obviously the system is just a language. So I keep talking about management because I interact on a daily basis with exceptionally successful entrepreneurs and other businessmen who have probably not even finished school. And they too operate very similarly. And I realized that for them, the only difference, the only benefit of having done an MBA is probably that I get to use some terms and some definitions which will make a particular conversation probably 5 minutes shorter, because a few jargons will help my team understand what I'm talking about. The same thing, someone who's finished just his third standard or third grade and doing a much larger business might be able to communicate the same thing, but he would have to reinvent the wheel in terms of being able to explain it. So it is that part of management which they saves that 5 minutes of mine that I was talking about as being the science of management, which can be universal. The other part of it is where I would say you can't probably define India as a geography, because India is so diverse. So if you're actually going to get into different styles and ways of management, we need to think way closer and we need to go way further, is what I was trying to say.
I'll just say that the Indian way of management has a future through Vasudhaivam Kutumbakam, because it's not only that I can see at least people are instrumentally coming closer to each other, may not be intrinsically. And the thing that is bringing them closer is sustainability. And both of the things I think are rooted in Vasudhaivam Kutumbakam, and it has been followed in the West, especially in the post-1980 with Freeman's stakeholder theory. And I see a great future of Vasudhaivam Kutumbakam as one of the founding pillars of management.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to make my last comment, which is relation to how to look at India, the reality of India. And it's an area that I've been very closely concerned with, which is called the informal sector. Management tends to ignore the informal sector 80%. You can, depending on who you read and what statistics you look at, it is still somewhere between 65 and 80% of India that contributes most of India's GDP but does not get counted. And there's the reason for informality has been mentioned as being why corporates are trying to reduce their costs and therefore the informal sector increases and so on. You know, this is only a very minor part of the answer. This is actually not the major answer. In my book, in the way I've researched this, the major reason Indian informal sector flourishes is because that is how they are. We are a relationship-based economy. Most informal people I have worked with, all these informal sectors, would not trade a job for this. They don't trust it. They trust their own little circles, their own little ways of doing it. They are in their own localities. So can we, in the whole management scenario, and since I'm in an IIM, let me pitch for this. Please look at this very carefully. The answer is not the formalization of the informal sector. The answer lies somewhere in a meeting point where you maintain the integrity of informality in the informal sector, maybe bring in a few rule-based things, but I have a feeling Indian businesses will flourish if you understand that. So that's my pitch before we open this. We've got about, I think we can manage about 5-10 minutes. Yeah?
The Indian management system is a management in a chaotic and unstructured environment how management takes place. So the context is different. Here it is, everything is unstructured. So the management cannot be structured. So one typical example, the serial bomb blast in Bombay occurred between 6:15 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. in the night. 235 people died. Number of racks were broken and the entire railway system came to a halt. Next day morning 8 o'clock, trains are running in the normal way. And the whole world was amazed. Such an unstructured system during the night of 10 hours, how the entire system came back. That is Indian management.
Hi, can I ask? So when we are talking about management, a different kind of, East-West, Indian way of doing things. So like what is the social construct of management? I'll make it easy for you. Like when we are saying that India has an organized chaos where things are decentralized, like Chaitra sir talked about temple management, where and you talked about the unincorporated sector. So who is doing the managing? Because it's decentralized. So like, basically it doesn't need a management. The people are managing themselves. So where is the management? No, obviously it has relations in public policy where you want to design government policies for, say, the unincorporated sector, how their social security can be increased. But where do you get in?
I will make it very quick in answering. See, if you say, where is the management in temple and this decentralization, there is this lot of talk around this kind of things. But imagine there is a temple, the whole range of people are involved in making sure that the temple is run properly. Starting from cleaning, to giving prasada, to which flower had to be brought for morning, what flower has to be brought in the evening, what patra, what pushpa is required, who will manage which crowd, what kind of community has to come, what ritual has to be done. It's a complex series of action that needs to be handled. People are handling. Now your question should be that I don't know who is the head, who is managing it. That could be possibly your question. And that could also be answered depending upon which organization you are actually trying to look at it. But what you must see is that people come together, they interact with each other, they cooperate with each other, and they run it systematically. You know, when these temples get actually disturbed, when you give it to government, corruption begins. Otherwise, they run it properly. Though there is an allegation on the private temples that they corrupt, etc. But you go and see them, you would actually realize. So there is a way of managing organization. Now, how does it happen? Who will run it? What is the nature of the power distribution, etc.? See, I have no idea of how it happens. If you ask me, I can give you one single description of how do I do it, because I'm involved in managing temple. Right? I have some role to play in my village. But the point is, I don't know. These things require research. And Indians have thought about it. Texts suggest that epigraphs tell us the same kind of story. And they will also allow certain tendencies. They kill certain tendencies. These temples do not allow people to take control over the temple. One or two individuals cannot. One or two communities cannot control it. Though you have full freedom as Dharmadhikari, Mukteswara, etc., but you can't really take whatever decision you wanted to take. There is some way that they manage it. We need to figure out how do they manage it. Now come to the question. Look at the question. So why do big corporations fail in India? A lot of big corporations. The question is, who control the power? Companies break down. They collapse. Now these things happen in an organization. Indians have noticed it. They developed sophisticated mechanism to deal with this kind of an intervention that one individual or one group of people could do in running a corporation. And they have thought about it far more seriously, which is exactly what Balu was yesterday referring to, collusion of ruling classes. The question is, what do we learn from Temple is a question none of us have an answer. We need to think about it. That's a question for future research.
Just very briefly, you have to look at the terms you're using to characterize what happens in India. It's organized chaos or unstructured, even informal formal, which is, I mean, those are the only terms we have. But actually they function as labels, which give us the illusion that we have some kind of understanding. It's impossible that this is unstructured. In the example Sir gave about the trains, only a highly structured system would be able to do this. Decentralized. Again, I mean, how does that term even make sense? It presupposes that there's a central authority and then it gets decentralized. Now, we would never say our body is decentralized. It's probably the most complex organism that exists on this planet. It's highly structured. But you can't say it's centralized, decentralized. So we have to stop using these terms as though they make sense to us, because they don't, and they do not allow us to characterize the highly structured system, organization that Chaitra was talking about just now.
Tell something, I mean, to the same person who asked the question. There is a book called Theory of Mind. I just forgot the author's name, and in that he is giving an anecdote of a visitor coming to a university. And the guide in the university is taking him everywhere. This is the botany department, that is the zoology department, this is the administrative block, this is the playground, that is the auditorium, this is the hostel and things like that. And then finally the visitor is asking, what is the university? So it is like that we have been taught mostly by the Harvard-centric management style, that it is the CEO who is taking the call. That's why we are looking at the Prime Minister, the Chief Minister, I don't know, the UN head to solve our problems, when we ourselves are making them stronger. So, I mean, coming back to my point that this world will be a better place when this Vasudhaivam Kutumbakam is not just for looking at people as one family, but treating also as equals, if not more. We do not do that, and then we search for solutions everywhere, not inside ourselves.
Last question, is that?
Yeah, excuse me, sorry. This is a question for the temple management. In the present era of globalization, where we are talking about cross-culture, is that temple management theory applicable? And apart from that, even in innovations and out-of-box thinking, can we apply that?
I have just two-line response to it. First of all, doesn't matter which organization you manage, management is management. You have to coordinate with people. You have to interact, you have to cooperate, you have to take decisions. Whether you do it in a business corporation, whether you do it in a temple, that's one part. Second, the innovation technology, that's nothing to do with management. That's a completely different domain. Once that is available, how do you use it in your corporation is a different game. I mean, so they're completely different domain. Now, temple management, did I talk about that model? In fact, I didn't. I wanted to discover what that model is. I don't know what that model is. I just said there is a possibility to look at it. I mean, I don't dare to make the claims that I understand what the temple management models are. We don't know. Probably in the afternoon, Jacob will throw some more problems associated with thinking about it, what difficulties we have in understanding temple management, etc.
I'll just add few lines to this thought process. Our business management is based on Shubh Labh. Indian philosophy of management is Shubh Labh. We And in the modern terminology, the Westerns are looking for a win-win situation for all the stakeholders. So our Indian system, you know, if you take the lesson from those Maurya empires and all, it was a very powerful management system. But again, everybody was involved by service, kushal karmas. Everybody of our Indian cultural, from whichever part you see in India, we had this system of having this high morale, as sir was calling Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. So ingrained with these ideas, we had a very powerful system, and that is the glimpses we see in that sir was calling for that train incident, which we could see. And the sum of the beautiful examples, successful examples, are wherever we are following this culture-based system, they are very good temple managements. And wherever the failure is there, because we go into the akushal karmas. When we forget about this Shubh Labh, into the akushal karmas, there the systems are hampered and jeopardized. And again, human rights are inbuilt in our cultural ethos, and we take, even till today, many of our Indians, illiterate or whatsoever you may call them, but they stick to those theorems, those laws, and they are successful in their business. I have seen in Punjab also, people, even those, they do not know how to sign, but they are shining in their business because of those things. Thank you very much.
You?
Power, conflict, ambiguity in the whole management strategy, the whole ambit of managing and management, the way it's understood and configured for India.
Well, look, my point is we cannot have a fixed kind of an alternative, because it should evolve. Because once I say this is it, then it becomes like I am selling ideology, not creating or co-creating knowledge. So about alternative, I'll just give you an example of
You talked about some professor who would American society, and Robert Jekyll exactly hits at that point. That's also pathological. So is an alternative.
Okay. Just 1 second. 1 minute max. My situation in the classroom when I see the brilliant minds of India is very, very precarious. You don't know. To teach them business ethics is a task in itself. But thing is that I just bring to the classroom the examples like Jamsetji Tata. Even if they have their way of countering that Tatas were into opium trade. And then I have to tell them that, look, opiums are also meant for making medicine. So it should be a dialogue rather than just shutting off the West and just pushing my agenda forward. Because if I'll shut off the West, we will not be here, because we will not have the mic, the light and things like that. So that should be a balance. But what that balance is, ma'am, sorry.
With just one point, I think it's a point that Chaitra made, and I think Jacob also, which is, I think, one of the things that we can help to move the needle forward is to have Indian case studies. you know, we tend not to look at our own case studies. We also, I mean, to the extent that I've understood the problems in management schools that I've been told, is the fact that we also don't know how to write teaching cases. You know, our case studies are not written in a form to be taught. And we don't have that. You talk about art and science, we don't have the art of writing teaching cases. So I think a lot of this has to do with things, not that we don't have knowledge, that we don't have examples, we don't have understanding. And we can interrogate some of these concepts if we really had ways in which we can communicate it in the classroom and to others. And I think that's probably the next kind of agenda. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for coming, and thanks to the panel.
With the permission of ma'am, we are concluding this panel discussion. And if you people did not get chance to ask questions, they can have a discussion outside. Okay. And may I request Professor Rudra Sen Sarma sir to now say a few concluding words and then give some felicitation mementos. Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon. I'll just clarify that I'm standing here in the capacity of Dean Research and not as an expert on culture and management. So we had a very enthralling session from distinguished experts. All of you are also experts in this area, and the last thing you deserve is for a non-expert to stand between you and lunch. So I'll just say that thank you all for coming to IIM. I hope you are having a good conference and a good stay here. And thanks to all the distinguished speakers on behalf of IIM. Thank you very much.
Sir, may I request you to give the moment of appreciation to Professor Vishwanath. Yes, can I request sir to give the moment of appreciation to Professor Chatra sir. May I request sir to give the appreciation moment to Kainadi sir. Sadhdev. May I request sir to give the memento to Siddharth Mohapatra sir. May I request Rudra Sen sir to give the memento to Jacob D. Rucover sir. May I request sir to finally give it to Subramanian sir. Thank you, sir.